Hey guys, welcome to Calm History. Tonight we begin in a place you've probably never tasted, but it sure leaves a bitter aftertaste. We're standing barefoot in the early morning frost, smoke curling from a crooked chimney, the faint scent of wood ash clinging to everything. The hens aren't even awake yet, and already you're reaching into a soot-blackened bucket with numb fingers. You are about to stir live water into cornmeal for something vaguely called ash cakes. Hey, if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. I'm curious where you're listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Now find a cozy spot. Take a slow, deep breath, and let your body sink into comfort as we journey back in time together. Congratulations. Yes, Ash. From the fireplace. Because why not? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You kneel beside the hearth, where yesterday's ashes are still warm enough to scald if you're careless. You scoop them into a clay bowl and add water. This is not a punishment, though it smells like one. It's breakfast. The lye seeps out of the ashes and transforms water into a primitive alkaline bath. You stir in cornmeal and maybe a bit of salt, if you've got any left from the last trade run. It thickens into a gray, gluey mush that looks like what you'd get if porridge and regret had a baby. This is what you eat today. This is also what you ate yesterday. And tomorrow? Well, you'll get to see this delightful mixture again. Probably slightly burnt, likely stuck to the same pan that no one has washed in 2 weeks. The early colonial settlers didn't wake up dreaming of omelets and French toast. They woke up praying that their food hadn't molded in the night. And lye-treated corn, known as hominy, was a kind of miracle. It softened the hard grain, released vital nutrients, and made the corn actually digestible. But don't get it twisted, miracle or not, it still tasted like sadness and dishwater. You slap a scoop of the mush onto a flat stone and set it in the embers. The coals hiss. A little too much lye, and your tongue tingles in a way that suggests soap more than sustenance. You try not to think about the burns on your fingers, or the fact that you're crouched next to a hearth that doubles as both oven and trash can, or that the previous batch of ash cakes fell into the fire, and someone still tried to eat them. This wasn't survival in the dramatic, frontier romance sort of way. This was daily, dull, edible struggle. Historians still argue whether this reliance on lye-treated corn came from Native American influence or sheer desperation. The truth is likely both. Indigenous peoples across the Americas had long used alkaline processing, nixtamalization, to unlock the full nutritional value of maize. Colonists copied the method, but without the knowledge, seasoning, or reverence. Just the ash. Just the hope. There's a soft clink behind you as someone sets a jug on the table. It's water, or it was. Now it's tepid, flecked with soot, and a little green around the cork. You drink it anyway, because your body doesn't care about flavor. It cares about staying vertical. The rooster crows again, as if to mock you. You eye him with a kind of culinary spite. But you won't eat him, yet. He's too useful. He's also faster than you. By now your ash cakes have solidified into something between a cracker and a regret. You eat one slowly. It crumbles into dry shards that stick in your molars. You chase it with water. You pretend it's soup. And as the morning brightens, you stare out the window, nothing fancy, just a cloth-patched hole in the wall, and wonder if anyone in London right now is also eating ashes. Probably not. But they also probably aren't alive out here. That's the trade. You tug your coat around your shoulders and head outside, still chewing. Your neighbor waves from across the frostbitten clearing, holding up a steaming pan of something dark and crispy. Ash bread, he calls out, like it's a treat. You both pretend it is. Somehow, the most horrifying part isn't the ash. It's the patience. The hours it takes to process the corn, boil the water, stir and strain, and cook by guesswork over a fire that doesn't care what you want. It's the waiting. For your meal. For your crop. For something, anything, that tastes like it came from a world that cared. But for now, this is what you have. A bowl of something gray, a few smudged embers, and the quiet certainty that tomorrow's breakfast will be exactly the same. The sun lifts just enough to catch the rim of your water barrel, and now you're squinting into your next mealtime with the hollow optimism of someone who knows it won't be any better than the last. The ash cake in your stomach sits there like a half-baked rock. But you need something else to chew, or gnaw, more accurately, so you reach for the crown jewel of colonial cuisine, hardtack. If you've never met a piece of hardtack, think of it as the world's most stubborn cracker. It's a thick, baked square of flour and water, no yeast, no oil, and definitely no joy. You tap it on the table. It taps back. You try to snap it in half, but it resists like it has a grudge. There's a reason people in the 1700s often soaked it in water, beer, or soup before eating. Your jaw is not designed to handle what amounts to edible brick. But there's no beer here. No soup either. Just that same tepid water from earlier and maybe a smear of bare fat, if you're lucky. You break a corner off. It splinters like old plaster. You chew carefully, each bite a test of whether your molars are still interested in being part of your face. Hardtack was the original shelf-stable disaster food. It could last for years, in barrels stacked on ships or wagons, where it slowly absorbed the flavors of whatever it was stored near. Sometimes that was smoked meat. Sometimes it was rat droppings. Either way, you ate it. The colonists weren't baking hardtack because it was delicious. They were baking it because it was reliable. Fire can ruin a stew. Bugs can spoil your grains. But hardtack? It laughs in the face of time. And you'll be laughing too, mostly to hide the sound of your jaw clicking out of alignment. Some people tried to dress it up. A little honey, maybe some butter if the cow felt generous that week. Others just gnawed straight through. Teeth were currency, and if you lost one, too bad. Your next biscuit might take another. You glance out the window, again, more like a warped hole in the wall with some fabric, and see your neighbor trying to slice through his own breakfast with a knife. Not the food. The knife. He's sawing at the edge of a biscuit so solid it could deflect a musket ball. He gives up and dunks it in a bucket of what might be cider. Or vinegar. Or disappointment. Historians still argue whether the popularity of hardtack was due to necessity or habit. Either way, it shows up in colonial journals with alarming frequency. Soldiers, sailors, settlers, everyone had some. Everyone hated it. But no one stopped making it. There's a legend of a man who left a biscuit in his trunk for 20 years. When he finally unearthed it, it was still edible. Edible is doing a lot of work there, but the point remains, hardtack was nearly immortal. Quirky detail? Some colonists carved designs into their biscuits, little stars or initials, not for decoration, but as a kind of edible journal. A marker of ownership. A defiant statement like, yes, I made this, and yes, I'm going to eat it, eventually. As you chew, you think about that. About how survival looked like discipline. How cooking wasn't an art, it was damage control. You weren't seasoning a meal, you were hiding how old it was. How stale. How chewed on, sometimes literally, by the mice that got there first. You pull a second biscuit from the tin. This one has a crack in it, probably from the weather, or maybe the time someone dropped the box while fending off a raccoon. You eat it anyway. It tastes like what you imagine the floor of an attic might taste like. There's no butter. There's no jam. But there is a kind of comfort, weirdly. A rhythmic chewing that keeps your jaw busy while your brain tries not to think too hard about anything. You walk outside and perch on a tree stump. It's not comfortable, but nothing is. The air is sharp and clean, the kind that pinches your nose and makes your eyes water a bit. And while you chew through your cracker brick, you watch a squirrel try to dig up a nut. He gives up. Probably found hardtack instead. By the time you're done, your jaw aches. But you're no longer hungry, and that's the victory. It doesn't have to be satisfying, it just has to be enough. It's barely mid-morning, and your jaw already feels like it's done a full day's work. You lean against the crooked doorframe, staring at the empty pantry shelf like it might whisper ideas if you wait long enough. But it doesn't. All it does is echo the truth. There is no sugar. No flour. No fresh fruit. But there is molasses. And oh, how the colonies loved their molasses. Thick, dark, syrupy, and shipped in by the barrel from the Caribbean, it clung to everything like a stubborn memory. It dripped into porridge, was stirred into tea, slathered over bread, and, when things got truly bleak, eaten by the spoonful straight from the jug. You open your own jug now. The smell is sharp and earthy, like burnt sugar mixed with the inside of a wet log. You tilt it slowly and watch the molasses ooze down like lava. It moves with the urgency of a sleeping cat. And yet, somehow, this was considered a delicacy. The molasses trade was a pillar of colonial life. It wasn't just a sweetener, it was practically currency. Rum makers hoarded it. Bakers needed it. Children were bribed with it. And when nothing else was around, folks just told themselves it counted as lunch. You drag a wooden spoon through the surface and take a taste. The bitterness hits first. A deep, almost metallic tang that makes your teeth hurt. Then comes the slow sweetness, heavy and brooding. It's the kind of taste that makes you question if you're supposed to like it, or just endure it. The texture is a cross between glue and resignation. It gets everywhere. On your fingers. In your eyebrows. Once, someone spilled it on the dog, and that poor beast spent a week attracting flies like royalty. You try to wipe your hands on your apron, but now your apron is sticky too. So is the table. So is the floor. Historians still argue whether the colonists truly enjoyed molasses or merely tolerated it because it kept them alive. There's something oddly poetic about that, surviving on something that moves like grief and tastes like compromise. And yet you keep using it. Because when you mix it with hot water and stale bread, it becomes pudding. If you add it to cornmeal and bake it over a fire, it's cake. When stirred into lard and oats, it's treats for the children. Quirky fact? Some colonial mothers believed molasses helped temper the blood, whatever that meant. Maybe it was a way to convince their kids to eat the same brown sludge for the third meal in a row. Today, you're making what your neighbor generously calls molasses tea. It's just hot water and a few tablespoons of the syrup stirred in with a stick. You take a sip. It tastes like something between old bandages and the back of a burnt marshmallow. You try to smile anyway. Because food wasn't just about nourishment, it was about coping. You couldn't control the weather, the harvest, or the mice chewing through your grain bags. But you could control how much molasses you used. Sort of. You bring the mug to your lips again, and watch a fly dive into the jug. You try not to take it personally. You fish him out with the back end of your spoon and figure you've probably swallowed worse. As the day warms, the syrup turns sluggish. It refuses to come out of the jug now, as if offended by the light. You scrape what you can into a small bowl. Maybe you'll smear it on a piece of hardtack later and call it dessert. Or you won't. Maybe you'll just stare at it and remember the time someone traded half a sack of flour for a single jar. That's how powerful molasses was. Or is. Depending on your definition of power. A distant bell clangs in the wind. It's just your neighbor chasing a goat again. But it reminds you that lunch is coming. And by lunch, you mean whatever combination of dried meat, mushy root, and yes, molasses you can slap together with minimum effort and maximum chewing. But that's okay. You made it through another morning. You've sweetened the edges of hunger with something dark, sticky, and completely irreplaceable. And now your hands are glued to the mug. How's your day going? If it's been a great one, drop a number 1 in the comments to spread some positive energy. And if things haven't felt quite right, drop a number 2, because you're not alone. I'm here with you, walking this journey together, so that each moment ahead feels a little lighter, a little more peaceful. By midday, your belly hums with that hollow colonial tune, part hunger, part fatigue, and part mild regret from licking the inside of the molasses jug. You're not exactly full. You're not exactly empty either. Just floating somewhere in that space where chewing feels optional and effort feels expensive. Which is when someone, probably you, decides it's time for meat tea. Yes, that's a real phrase. You wander to the hearth, where a dented pot rests atop a tripod of blackened iron. Inside is a slurry of water, marrow, fat globules, and what might once have been squirrel, or venison, or something unnameable scraped from the side of a stew bone. You stir it slowly with a wooden spoon that's seen better centuries. The surface glistens like old lip balm. Colonists believed in the healing power of broth, bone broth, meat water, suet soup. Whatever you called it, it was hot, salty, and thin. Not soup. Not stew. Just meat tea. You pour some into a wooden cup. The liquid has separated slightly, like it's trying to escape itself. Steam rises, along with the faint scent of old rope, wild onions, and wet stone. You blow on it gently, though the heat's already gone. It cools faster than your enthusiasm. You sip. It coats your tongue like lukewarm dishwater spiked with a whisper of animal. But you tell yourself this is restorative. A kind of primitive electrolyte drink. It was, after all, packed with nutrients, or at least a ghost of nutrients. Mainstream fact? Bone broth was considered medicinal across many cultures, from Native American pemmican traditions to French consommes. Colonists inherited this broth-based belief system and stretched it to comical lengths. Feeling weak? Meat tea. Feeling cold? Meat tea. Lost a toe to frostbite? Double meat tea. Quirky fact? Some households added crumbled hardtack directly into the broth to soften it, an abomination that created a grayish mush dubbed stirabout. Others floated eggshells in the pot, believing it clarified the broth. In reality, it mostly gave it crunch. You take another sip? There's a grainy slickness to it now, as if the pot remembered it hasn't been properly cleaned since your uncle borrowed it to boil muskrat hides last spring. The aftertaste is instructional, like it's trying to teach you something. Something vague and slightly unsettling. Historians still argue whether the term meat tea was aspirational or simply honest. It wasn't hearty. It wasn't filling. But it existed. And sometimes that was enough. You dunk a corner of dried bread into the cup, watch it swell with broth, then fall apart like someone giving up mid-sentence. You spoon it anyway. Every bite is a test of your tolerance for texture. Smooth, then gritty. Hot, then somehow furry? Still, there's comfort in it. The warmth creeps down your throat, settling into your chest like an old dog curling up by the fire. You don't feel stronger, but you feel occupied. And sometimes that's more useful than strength. You glance outside. Snow is gathering on the edge of the roof. A blackbird hops along the fence post and pecks at a frozen something. Maybe he's had his own meat tea, in bird form. You take one last sip and feel the fatty rim of the broth cling to your lips. It's not satisfying, but it's familiar. And in a world where storms roll in unannounced and wolves sometimes wander into the garden, familiar matters. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve and set the cup down. The tea, if we dare still call it that, has gone cold. A skin has formed on top. You stir it half-heartedly. It resists. You don't blame it. You step outside with the aftertaste of meat tea still coating your tongue like old candle wax, and the wind immediately tries to claim your breath. It's colder now, sharper, like the seasons decided to stop playing nice. You wrap your shawl tighter and glance toward the vegetable patch. Calling it a patch might be generous. It's really just a section of earth you've scraped out with a rusted hoe and whispered encouragement to. But there, under a light frost, is your prize, a few lonely parsnips. Not carrots. Not potatoes. Parsnips. The pale, ghostly cousins of better vegetables. You dig one up. It looks like a witch's finger, crooked and swollen, with dirt packed into every line. It's not pretty, but it's edible. And that's all you're asking today? Inside, you scrape it clean and slice it into thin rounds. The knife resists, as if it also thinks you should be eating something else. You toss the slices into a pan with a lump of lard and set them over the fire. They sizzle faintly, like they're whispering their resignation to the universe. Parsnips were a colonial staple. Not because they were loved, but because they were survivors. They grew in poor soil. They withstood frost. They waited patiently underground like awkward truths. You could roast them, boil them, mash them, though each method produced slightly different variations of meh. Mainstream fact? Before sugarcane became widely accessible, parsnips were considered a natural sweetener. Colonists even used them to flavor cakes and elish. That's right, parsnip ale. Something to drink when you've lost all other hope. Today, though, it's just fried parsnips. You sprinkle a bit of salt on top. The result is something between a chip and a chewy memory. The outside crisps slightly, but the inside remains soft, almost defiantly so. You chew slowly. Each bite offers a hint of earthiness. Not the romantic, truffle-hinted earthiness of modern menus. No, this is the literal taste of earth. Dirt. Roots. A reminder that your meal was clawed out of the ground, not bought or begged. Quirky tidbit? Some colonists believed parsnips, when left in the ground through the first frost, became sweeter. So, people developed the odd tradition of talking to their parsnips. Singing to them. Apologizing to them before pulling them up. You consider whispering to yours, but figure at this point, your relationship is strictly professional. You eat in silence, except for the occasional creak of the wood stove and the wind elbowing its way through the gaps in your cabin wall. You count the slices. 5 remain. You ration them automatically, as though some deep, ancestral part of your brain still fears you'll run out before supper. Historians still argue whether the colonial fondness for root vegetables was due to necessity or taste. Frankly, taste didn't get a vote. If it grew, you ate it. If it didn't, you waited. Or cried. Quietly. While chewing something beige. There's a tiny burned edge on the last slice. You eat it anyway. It's crispy, bitter, and oddly satisfying, like revenge on the vegetable that dared to make you work this hard. You scrape the pan clean. There's a little bit of lard left congealing at the bottom. You dip a corner of old bread into it and pop it in your mouth. Not great. Not even good. But calories. That's what most colonial meals came down to, not joy, but math. Calories in, effort out. If the balance tipped the wrong way, you didn't eat. Or worse, you did eat, but it made you sick. Spoiled meat. Bad roots. Funky grains. You'd learn fast. You pack away the parsnip peelings to toss to the chickens, if they're still around. Last time you checked, one wandered off with the neighbor's dog and hasn't been seen since. Still, your belly's a little fuller now. And while it may not feel like a feast, you've eaten something. In the colonies, that was enough to count as a small victory. The kind you whisper to yourself about on long, hungry nights. The fire's burnt low, and your hands smell faintly of lard and parsnip skin. You pull a thin wool shawl tighter around your shoulders and sit near the hearth, staring at a small cloth sack that holds your most unpredictable friend in this culinary nightmare, cornmeal. It's not fancy. It's not even always yellow. Sometimes it comes out more gray than gold, depending on the grind and the grit. You untie the string and peek inside. The texture is coarse, almost sandy. Not the fine, soft flour you dream of. This stuff feels like it might file down your teeth over time. But it's precious. You could make mush. You could make johnny cakes. You could, if you're feeling particularly wild, mix it with lard and bake a brittle loaf over embers. That's what's on the agenda today. You dump a handful into a cracked bowl, add a splash of water and a dollop of that same lard from earlier, and stir with a wooden spoon. The mixture fights you. It clumps where it should flow, cracks where it should bind. But you push through. The dough, if you can call it that, is formed by sheer willpower and colonial stubbornness. You slap it onto a flat stone near the fire. Not in a pan. Not in an oven. Just a hot rock and a prayer. Mainstream fact? Cornmeal was the backbone of many colonial diets, especially in places where wheat simply wouldn't grow. Indigenous peoples had used maize in hundreds of ingenious ways long before settlers arrived, and colonists adopted and adapted those methods, often badly. The result? Gritty, dry, occasionally charred patties that could technically be called food. Quirky tidbit? Some settlers kept a separate, cornmeal rag, for wiping up spills of the stuff, because once cornmeal hit a wooden floor, it was nearly impossible to sweep. It just lodged itself into the cracks and took up residence like a rude tenant. As your patty cooks, the edges begin to curl. A faint smell rises, warm, nutty, a little like wet rope and disappointment. You flip it with a piece of bark. It sizzles, then coughs up a small wisp of smoke. It's ready. Or at least no longer dangerous. You tear off a piece and chew. It crunches, then dissolves into a mealy paste that sticks to the roof of your mouth like edible drywall. There's no salt. No spice. No hint of comfort. Just sustenance, the colonial version of a love letter that simply reads, "I tried." Historians still argue whether johnnycakes were a true innovation or just a necessary evil. Some insist they were beloved, a warm reminder of native influence and New World survival. Others say the colonists merely endured them because it was the only grain option besides boiled oats and prayer. You take another bite and pretend it's something fancier. You imagine butter. Maybe honey. Or a fried egg, though you haven't seen a chicken all day. You chew with determination, not enjoyment. Your teeth crunch down on an unexpected grain of grit, and for a moment you see stars. Not metaphorically. You might have just chipped something. Still, you eat the rest. Waste not, want not. When you're finished, you lick the crumbs from your fingertips and glance at the ragged scrap of parchment pinned to the wall, your weekly meal chart. A total fiction. Every box says the same thing. Maybe stew. Some days, it's more accurate than others. You settle back into your creaky chair, belly humming with the dull thud of processed corn. It's not happiness. But it's not hunger either. You've survived lunch. Now comes the harder part, waiting for the next excuse to cook something else that isn't quite food but also isn't not food. Just edible ambition. Outside, the wind sharpens its tone, threading through the cracks in your cabin walls like it's looking for something it lost last winter. You shift closer to the fire, though closer really just means less far from freezing. There's still a bit of light in the sky, but the day is limping toward evening, and your thoughts are already orbiting dinner. Which means you're now confronting the great gamble of colonial cuisine: beans. Beans are finicky. They seem simple, dry, humble, harmless, but oh, how they plot. First, you have to soak them. You remember this detail only after you've poured a handful into a pot of cold water and stared at them like they might feel guilt and soften immediately. No such luck. So you soak. You wait. You wonder whether you remembered to check the beans for weevils this time. Last week you didn't, and the extra protein came with tiny legs. You convince yourself that's behind you now. Mainstream fact? Beans were a staple of colonial life for one very good reason: they store forever. Or almost forever. If kept dry and safe from pests, they could last through winters, droughts, and waves of poor decision-making. Quirky tidbit? Some households bury jars of beans beneath floorboards or in root cellars, occasionally forgetting about them for decades. There's at least one record of a jar being unearthed during a wedding, causing confusion, a mild moral panic, and a brief debate about whether they should be cooked or preserved as heirlooms. You poke at your pot. The beans, having been semi-soaked earlier in a fog of forgetfulness, are softening like old arguments, slowly and with resistance. You toss in a chunk of salted pork. Not bacon. Not ham. Just a piece of something vaguely pig-shaped, half salt and half memory. You add some onion if you have it. Maybe a bit of molasses, if you're feeling bold and want to pretend this is a festive occasion. The pot simmers slowly, grumbling like it disapproves of your life choices. You stir. You wait. You stir again. A skin forms on top, and you blow it away like dandelion fluff. Historians still argue whether colonial baked beans were a New England invention or an English holdover. Some claim they originated from native Wampanoag recipes passed to the Pilgrims. Others say the English simply brought their own version and slapped a different name on it. Whatever the truth, your beans are boiling now. They smell brown. That's not a color you can smell, you say? Then you haven't spent enough time in colonial kitchens. You ladle out a scoop and blow on it. The texture is better than expected, firm but yielding, hearty without being heavy. You chew slowly, then blink as a hint of molasses sneaks in. Sweetness. You practically faint. But then the salt pork reminds you who's boss. Its presence is not subtle. It's like someone soaked a tire in ocean water and whispered, "Pork, near it." Still you eat. You eat until the bowl is empty. You eat like someone who has known worse. And truthfully, you have. Remember the meat tea? You scrape the last of the beans from the pot with your finger and lick it clean. Then you lean back in your chair, letting the warmth spread out through your limbs. It's not joy. It's not even satisfaction. But it's sustenance with a whisper of flavor. A luxury in a world where flavor often feels like gossip. Your belly makes a sound, not quite approval, but not rebellion either. You consider that a win. The fire pops. The wind moans. Somewhere outside, a rooster who doesn't understand time crows once, then gives up halfway through. You close your eyes briefly and think, yes. Beans. Not great. But definitely better than ashes. You rise slowly from your seat, the weight of beans settling in your stomach like you've just eaten a small rock wrapped in a warm blanket. Outside, the light's finally gone. The room dims, shadows crawl up the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a fox howls like it's late for a terrible dinner party. Speaking of which, you're now considering dessert. Or at least the colonial idea of it. You smile grimly at the thought, because in your world, dessert isn't chocolate or cake or buttery tarts with glazes that shimmer in candlelight. No. Dessert is usually apple leather. If you're lucky. You reach for the folded bundle wrapped in cloth and twine, tucked into a high shelf to keep it away from mice, dampness, and your own sense of shame. You unwrap it like a relic and hold up a sheet of something dark, leathery, and vaguely fruity. You tear off a strip and chew. And chew. And chew some more. Apple leather is what happens when someone looks at a pile of apples, considers making a pie, then remembers they have no butter, no flour, no oven, and no hope. So instead, they mash the apples, maybe sweeten them with molasses, and dry the mixture into something between fruit jerky and shoe repair. Mainstream fact? Apple leather, sometimes called spapple, or apple paste, was a colonial method of preserving excess fruit, especially in autumn, when harvests had to be stretched into the bleak winter months. It was portable, durable, and nearly indestructible. Quirky tidbit? Some households made decorative shapes out of apple leather, stars, hearts, or, confusingly, pigs. These were often gifted during winter visits or served with tea as a sign of seasonal cheer. Chewing them, however, felt like entering a duel with your own molars. The strip softens slowly in your mouth. It has the sweet-sour profile of forgotten fruit, with just a whisper of cinnamon, if you're lucky enough to have traded for any. Mostly, though, it tastes like ambition dried under muslin and left in the sun for 3 days. Historians still argue whether apple leather began as a survival tactic, or a treat. Some insist it was the candy of its time, a novelty at town gatherings. Others argue it was simply the last resort for overripe apples and bored homemakers with too much cloth and too little butter. You chew another strip. Your jaw starts to ache. But you're not going to let this dessert defeat you. Dessert, after all, is symbolic. It's hope, in chewy form. You sit back, letting the firelight flicker across the ragged edge of your apple leather. The shadows it casts on the wall look like dancing ghosts, or maybe just smoke. It's not indulgence. It's not decadence. But it's something sweet, and in a life this salt-heavy, that counts. You tuck the rest away, rewrap the bundle, and whisper to it like it's your secret. Because tomorrow, when the beans are bland and the parsnips blander, you'll want that tiny glimpse of sugar again. You'll want to remember that even in a world of ash and ash-adjacent meals, someone still thought to flatten fruit and make it into joy. A chewy, mildly sour joy. But joy nonetheless. Night has properly settled now. The wind's pressing against the window panes like a nosy neighbor, and the embers in the hearth sigh every time you shift in your seat. You press your palm to your stomach. Still intact. That's good. Because tomorrow, well, tomorrow's going to start with something that makes being seen gourmet: fire cake. You've made fire cake before. Everyone in the settlement has. It's not a recipe so much as a surrender. You wake up early, pull on your heaviest socks, even though they barely qualify as socks anymore, and reach for the flour tin. It's half full, maybe less, and what's left is coarse. No fancy sifted white stuff here. This is barely processed, unbleached, and not even guaranteed to be wheat. It could be rye. Could be powdered bark. You've stopped asking. Mainstream fact? Fire cake was the go-to ration for soldiers in the American Revolutionary War, but versions of it existed in colonial kitchens well before. It's flour and water. That's it. No yeast. No salt. No fat. Just paste and the will to survive. Quirky tidbit? Some soldiers allegedly chewed fire cake as a form of punishment, not because they had to, but because it was so awful, it counted as penance. One letter describes it as a bread that breaks rather than bends. You stir together your flour and water until it forms a sticky, grayish lump. Then you press it into a flat disc and slap it against a hot stone by the fire. It hisses. Smokes. Immediately cracks down the middle like it's trying to escape its own existence. You stare at it while it cooks. The edges go brown, sometimes. Other times they just blacken and curl. You flip it with a stick and cough from the smoke. And you wait. Because even bad bread takes time. Historians still argue whether fire cake was born purely from desperation or if it had some culinary cousin in rustic peasant bread traditions back in Europe. Either way, no one makes it by choice. You pull the thing off the stone. It's hot. Dry. Chalky. You tear off a piece and bite. It's like gnawing drywall. The outside is hard. The inside is gummy. There's no taste. None. Not even the ghost of grain. But it fills the stomach. Barely. You chew slowly, then wash it down with the thinnest tea you've ever made. Just warm water and a sprig of something green. You call it mint. It might be moss. Still, you sip it proudly. Because on mornings like this, with no meat, no fruit, and only a fire for company, you need ritual, and this, in all its awful blandness, is ritual. A sacrament to survival. You think about yesterday's apple leather. That was dessert. This is penance. And yet, as the first light peeks through the shutter slats, you feel a strange sort of comfort. You're full. You're warm. You're still here. And in a world where fire cake is breakfast, that's no small thing. Later that same morning, with fire cake lodged somewhere in your chest like a very patient rock, you head outside into the bitter air. The frost crunches under your boots, and your breath rises in short, exasperated puffs. You're on a mission, gathering lie ashes. Because today's not just another bland food day. It's hominy day, and that means wood ash. You shuffle toward the hearth pit out back, where yesterday's firewood has died into a heap of soft gray fluff. You scoop the finest ash into a pot, careful not to disturb the blackened lumps underneath. You've learned the hard way. It's the lightest, driest ash that makes the best lye. Back inside, you pour water over the ashes and let it sit, steeping like the world's worst tea. Mainstream fact? Lye water was essential for making hominy, a staple made by soaking dried corn kernels in an alkaline solution, usually created with wood ash. The chemical reaction softened the kernels, loosened the husks, and transformed them into something edible. Quirky tidbit? Some folks swore certain woods gave better ash. Hickory made smoother hominy, according to one recipe. Others insisted oak ash gave it a richer flavor, though the idea of rich in this context feels optimistic at best. You strain the lye carefully, trying not to burn your hands. It's caustic stuff, strong enough to dissolve a fingernail if left long enough. That's part of the magic. And the menace. You add your corn to the pot. The kernels float briefly, then start to sink. They'll need hours. Maybe more. So you stir occasionally, adjust the fire, and keep the windows open. Because this smells, not violently, but unmistakably, a blend of burnt wood, wet grain, and that weird mineral funk you only notice when your nose is too close for too long. Historians still argue whether hominy in colonial kitchens was directly taught by native tribes or slowly adapted from multiple indigenous food traditions across the Americas. Either way, without it, early settlers might not have lasted the winters. By late afternoon, the corn is puffed and pale. You rinse it in cold water, twice, 3 times, until the husks slide off like sleepy jackets. The kernels look swollen, alive in a strange, translucent way. Like corn that's been to therapy. You taste one. It's soft. A little slippery. Slightly alkaline. You're not sure if it's food or a science experiment gone suspiciously right. But you cook it down with some salted pork, or maybe just the leftover grease from when salted pork was still a thing, and suddenly it's a meal. A heavy one. A humble one. But it holds your ribs together when the winds outside try to pry them apart. You eat slowly, grateful for the warmth. For the ash. For the science you don't fully understand. Because somehow, someone once looked at a pile of rocks and fire leftovers and thought, yeah, let's soak dinner in that. And honestly, it kind of worked. By the time the hominy has settled in your gut like a quiet tenant that pays rent in starch, you're feeling daring. You open the pantry door, not because you expect treasure, but because you like a good mystery. And there it is, as always, a collection of jars, crocks, and cheesecloth bundles that whisper both promise and threat. You reach for something unlabeled. Because in a colonial pantry, nothing was labeled. That would require ink, paper, and time you spent chasing runaway chickens. You unscrew a lid. Sniff. Frown. Sniff again. Well, it hasn't gone bad, but it hasn't exactly gone good either. You hesitate. Then you remember, in this era, food safety isn't a science. It's a gamble. Mainstream fact? Colonial preservation methods included salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and burying food in cool root cellars. But without refrigeration or reliable sterilization, spoilage was constant. What didn't mold might ferment. What didn't ferment might grow weirdly fuzzy. What didn't grow fuzzy? Still questionable. Quirky tidbit? Some settlers believed mold on cheese was a sign of blessing. They'd scrape it off, eat the cheese, and call it a day. Others, less optimistic, added brandy to everything, believing alcohol could correct whatever sins time had inflicted. You poke the mystery substance with a spoon. It jiggles. That's either good, or a sign you've angered a minor kitchen deity. You taste it, just a corner. It's pickled. Probably cabbage. Maybe turnip. Possibly something that began its life as one and ended as the other. You eat a few cautious bites, then feel that all too familiar warm and weird sensation crawling up your esophagus. And still, you keep going. Because in a world without best-by dates, every meal is a trust fall. Historians still argue whether colonial food instincts were superior to ours, or if people just got better at ignoring bad outcomes. After all, when half your neighbors have already had a touch of the flux, this season, what's one more questionable bite? You wash your jar snack down with a swig of cider that's been resting for a bit too long. It bites the back of your throat with that fermented twang of regret and resolve. You burp. A little fire cake reappears. You swallow it again. Victory. Evening slips in like smoke through the cracks in the walls. The candles hiss as you light them, the room smelling like tallow and courage. You're still upright. You're still digesting. And you haven't gone blind. A win is a win. You think back to the ashes. The lie. The hardtack. The untrustworthy pickles. Colonial life doesn't give you what you want, but it does give you what you can survive. And tonight you survived. Barely. Questionably. Impressively. Which means tomorrow, you get to do it all again. Hey, if you like these stories, please comment number 1. If not satisfied, comment number 2 so we can improve the topic better. The next morning, you hear footsteps crunching up the frostbitten path outside your cabin. That means one of two things: trouble or company. And in colonial life, those were often the same thing. You open the door to find your neighbor, face ruddy, breast steaming, holding a pot wrapped in a woven cloth. A gift, they say. A stew. You take it with a smile that twitches at the edges. Because neighborly stew is a gamble wrapped in linen. You're too polite to ask what's in it. Too hungry not to eat it. Too experienced not to fear it. Mainstream fact? Sharing food was part of colonial survival, an unspoken pact in a world where death might show up before dessert. Communities relied on mutual aid, especially during long winters or failed harvests. Quirky tidbit? Some colonial recipes featured ingredients like squirrel brains, bear grease, or eel, each considered hearty and nutritious at the time. Other stews stretched whatever scraps were available with crushed crackers, spoiled milk, or even stale dough boiled until it looked like dumplings, if you squinted. You set the pot down by the fire, lift the lid. The smell is not bad. Not good either. There's a whiff of something vaguely meaty, tinged with onions, and the unmistakable funk of long-simmered root vegetables that lost their will to live somewhere around hour 5. Inside the pot, you spot a few turnip chunks, maybe a sliver of something that once belonged to a rabbit, and wait, yes. Definitely a bone. You just can't tell if it was cooked in or fell in. Historians still argue whether colonial stews were inspired by old-world peasant cooking or improvised entirely out of necessity. Either way, the result was the same: endless boiling until texture, taste, and identity all dissolved into one sleepy gray murk. You ladle some into a wooden bowl, trying not to splash your sleeve. You blow on the steam. Sip. It's fine. It's warm. It's vaguely flavored. It doesn't bite back. You chew a piece of carrot that's more suggestion than substance, and glance across the room at your guests. Because yes, they've stayed. Of course. They have. They're seated by the hearth, holding their cup of cider like it's a chalice of gold. The stew stretches enough for two. Barely. Conversation is slow. Topics range from who broke their wagon wheel this week, to how your cabbage patch looks less scrawny than last year's. You nod. Smile. Swirl the spoon. Another bite. The texture's improved. Or your mouth has given up. Either way, it fills the room with something resembling comfort. Not joy. Not flavor. But that low, humming satisfaction of hot food on a cold day shared with someone who also once ate eel pie and lived to tell it. You finish your bowl. Your guest finishes theirs. The pot, empty now, is placed by the fire. Tomorrow, you'll use it to boil something else unrecognizable. For now, though, you survived another meal. Together. Once the stew has been scraped clean and the neighbor has finally, blessedly trudged back into the frozen blur of afternoon, you turn to one of the more personal cooking rituals of colonial life: ash cakes. Not to be confused with any sort of modern cake. These are not sweet, or fluffy, or celebratory. Ash cakes are what you make when flour is scarce, patience is thin, and your standards have dropped through the dirt floor. Mainstream fact? Ash cakes, also called jana cakes, journey cakes, or fire cakes depending on the region, were a staple for colonists, enslaved people, and soldiers alike. The concept was simple: cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt if you were feeling wild, and heat. The twist? You cook them directly in the ashes. Not a pan. Not on a griddle. In the fire. You kneel by the hearth and rake aside the coals, exposing a patch of warm gray ash. You mix the batter in a wooden bowl, just cornmeal and water today, and form it into a disc. It sags slightly, more slurry than dough. You flatten it with your palm, ignoring how gritty it already feels. Then you toss it, unceremoniously, into the ash. Not above. Not beside. In. The heat from the embers starts working immediately. You cover it lightly with more ash, then nestle a few coals around it to trap the warmth. Now you wait. 15 minutes. Maybe 20. Time is flexible when the clocks are unreliable, and you're judging doneness by instinct and smell. Quirky tidbit? Some colonial cooks swore by wrapping the dough in cabbage or corn husks before burying it in the ash, to protect it from burning. Others? They just embraced the crunch. A little charcoal never hurt anyone. Unless you bit into a nail. You pull the ash cake from its sooty cradle with a stick. It's vaguely golden. Hot. The edges have crisped. The center feels solid. You brush it off, burning your fingers in the process. Because oven mitts don't exist, and apparently fingerprints are optional in the colonies. You break it open. Steam wisps out. It smells faintly nutty, earthy, and, let's be honest, like smoke and desperation. You take a bite. It's dry. Gritty. And somewhere in your mouth is a fleck of coal that you pretend is seasoning. Historians still argue whether ash cakes originated from Native American cooking techniques or evolved out of sheer necessity during flour shortages. Either way, they're a monument to edible resilience. You eat slowly. Not because it tastes good, but because chewing takes time. And when chewing takes effort, you forget how hungry you are. Your jaw aches by the third bite. By the fifth, you start seeing the appeal of soup again. Still, something about this moment feels timeless. Primitive, but sacred. You, the hearth, the ash. The knowledge that if you dropped everything else, the molasses, the pickles, the dubious meat, this one thing could still feed you. Even if it occasionally breaks your tooth. Your stomach has calmed, your jaw has recovered, mostly, and now you stand in the root cellar, facing what might be the single greatest act of delusion in colonial cuisine, preservation. Rows of jars glint dully in the torchlight. Some hold floating turnips, others mysterious berries suspended in syrup the color of regret. A few are dusted with mildew, their wax seals broken like promises. You pick one up. Shake it gently. It sloshes back. You sigh. Because today, it's time to preserve misery in jars. Mainstream fact? Without refrigeration, colonists had to rely on preserving food through pickling, fermenting, drying, salting, and canning, if they were wealthy enough to afford glass jars and tin lids. Most preservation was seasonal, labor-intensive, and experimental, depending heavily on local conditions and sheer hope. You haul a crate of limp parsnips to the table. They're soft, rubbery, unenthusiastic. But in colonial America, nothing went to waste. So you peel them, cube them, and boil them with vinegar and cloves. The whole kitchen smells like a spice merchant's boot. Quirky tidbit? One common colonial jam was made from watermelon rinds, not the sweet red part, but the green-white scrap no one wants. Boiled, sugared, spiced. The result? Something that tasted vaguely like sadness and wet leather, but it kept for months. You spoon the steaming mash into jars, carefully pouring hot wax to seal the tops. You work slowly, rhythmically, jar after jar after jar. You're not just preserving food, you're preserving effort. You're bottling a day's worth of labor into something your future self might not curse. The jars go back into the cellar. You stack them beside last year's carrots, which have developed eyes and ambitions. It's best not to look too closely. Historians still argue whether colonial preservation techniques were truly effective or mostly symbolic. Some methods, like pickling in brine, worked well enough to feed families through winter. Others, like storing butter in a sheep's bladder, were acts of blind optimism. Back upstairs, you scrawl names on crude labels using berry ink and a feather. Appleish chunks. Maybe rhubarb. Root stuff number 3. You smile. Because you know the names don't matter. In 2 months, when snow buries the path and your woodpile runs low, you'll be thankful for anything that can be boiled, salted, and swallowed with your eyes closed. You wipe your hands on your apron, suddenly aware that everything smells like vinegar and melted wax. You did it. You preserved the unlovable, pickled the forgettable, jarred the inedible, and somewhere between the boiling and the sealing, you earned another day's worth of survival. A shelf of despair? Maybe. But it's your despair. And it'll keep After the vinegar haze clears and your fingers have regained feeling, you wander back toward the fireplace, only to be reminded of a special task that no colonial cook can avoid for long: rendering fat. Yes, tonight you're making lard. Mainstream fact? In colonial kitchens, rendered animal fat wasn't just a cooking staple. It was currency. It flavored biscuits, greased pans, sealed jars, oiled leather, and even filled lamps. Lard was liquid gold, if gold smelled faintly like bacon and old shoes. You pull the pig fat from a wooden bucket, still cool and waxy from the cellar. It jiggles in a way that's somehow both comical and menacing. You cube it slowly, the knife sticking now and then as it hits unexpected sinew. You mutter. The pig doesn't care. The fat goes into a black iron pot suspended over the fire. Slowly it begins to melt. Quirky tidbit? Some colonial cooks swore that whispering prayers while stirring the fat helped prevent it from burning. Others claimed that tossing in an onion skin purified the lard's spirit. Whether mystical or practical, the ritual kept hands busy and minds from wandering too far into existential despair. You stir, watching the soft white chunks turn translucent. The smell is strong. Not bad, not good. Just heavy. Like your great-uncle's wool coat after a rainstorm. The fire crackles, and soon the pot is bubbling. A layer of clear liquid rises, shimmering like a swamp at sunset. You ladle it out, straining it through cloth into a jar. The rest? Still cooking, still hissing. This is the rhythm of the colonial kitchen. Render, stir, strain. Repeat. Historians still argue whether the obsession with lard was born out of necessity or taste. Was it truly beloved, or simply the only fat available that didn't immediately kill you? The jury remains slippery. You let the fat cool and congeal. It sets into a pale, creamy paste that will soon live in a stone crock beside your fire. Ready to be scooped, slathered, and spread on whatever tomorrow brings, likely more ash cakes. You wipe your brow, suddenly aware of how warm the room has become. The fire roars, the pot simmers, and your sleeves are damp with sweat and pork residue. A winning combination, truly. You sit down beside the hearth, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel accomplished. As if this strange alchemy of muscle and flame has made you master of something ancient. Your floor may be dirt. Your stew may still taste like confusion. But your lard? Perfect. Almost enough to make you feel rich. Almost. With the last of the lard tucked away and your apron smelling unmistakably like the inside of a torchlit smokehouse, you finally turn to a task that is both delicate and slightly absurd: brewing your own vinegar. Yes. Because in colonial kitchens, if life gave you rotting fruit, you made vinegar. Slowly. Questionably. And with more microbial mystery than science. Mainstream fact? Vinegar was essential in the colonies, not just for flavor, but for food preservation, cleaning wounds, and keeping pests away. It was also one of the few ways colonists could make something acidic without access to citrus or refrigeration. The problem? It took forever. And you had to basically let things rot, on purpose. You open a small barrel in the corner, its contents a medley of mashed apples, cloudy water, and the faint promise of alcohol. You sniff. It punches you in the sinuses like a slightly drunk raccoon. Perfect. This is the mother, a gelatinous mat of bacteria and yeast floating near the top. She's not pretty. She looks like a jellyfish that gave up halfway through forming. But she's the soul of your vinegar, and you treat her with reverence. You stir slowly, careful not to disturb her too much. The mixture needs time. Weeks, sometimes months. You add a few apple peels to feed her. Maybe a bit of molasses if you're feeling generous. Quirky tidbit? Colonial children were sometimes tasked with singing to the vinegar barrel, half out of superstition, half to ensure they didn't sneak sips. Some families even named their vinegar mothers, passing them down through generations like pickled family heirlooms. You cover the barrel with cheesecloth, muttering a half-hearted blessing, and set it back in the warmest corner of the kitchen. There it will sit. It may thrive. It may die. But like everything else in this kitchen, it depends on temperature, time, and a fair amount of divine indifference. Historians still argue whether early American vinegar-making techniques were borrowed directly from European methods or adapted to local conditions. Either way, the results were unpredictable, and varied wildly between households. You think back to that neighbor's stew and wonder, was it flavored with vinegar, or just an accident that went too far? A creak in the beams above reminds you the house is old. You're old. Or at least, you feel that way tonight. You pour yourself a cup of cider, actual cider, thankfully not turned yet, and sit near the barrel. Its surface bubbles faintly, as if sighing. Like it, you're fermenting. Not into something elegant, but something usable. You raise your mug in a toast to survival. To the mother, to the mold, to the magic of rot. Because in a world with no lemons, no sugar, no fridge, and no microwave, vinegar is hope. And hope, as it turns out, smells a lot like fermented apples and bad decisions. You wake the next morning with the faintest scent of vinegar still clinging to your sleeves, your mouth dry, and your fire barely smoldering. Outside, the frost glazes every surface in white defiance, and inside? Breakfast calls. But don't get too excited. Because breakfast, in colonial times, wasn't so much a meal as a quiet negotiation between what you had and what you could stomach before dawn. Mainstream fact? The typical colonial breakfast varied wildly depending on region and season, but for most, it involved mush. Cornmeal mush, oat mush, rice mush, whatever could be boiled and spooned. If you were lucky, there might be molasses. If you were rich, tea. If you were cursed, salt pork. You ladled yesterday's leftover cornmeal mush from a wooden bowl. It's stiff now, more sculpture than sustenance. You chop it into wedges and fry it in yesterday's grease until the edges crisp. The smell is comforting. Familiar. Slightly alarming. You reach for the molasses jar, a thick ceramic pot crusted around the edges. You scoop out a spoonful, sticky and dark as ink, and drizzle it over the mush. It slides slowly, defiantly, like it knows it's the highlight of your day. Quirky tidbit? Molasses was so central to colonial breakfast that some families used it to brush their teeth. Not effectively, but enthusiastically. This sweet tooth was less a concept and more a survival mechanism. You eat slowly, scraping your wooden spoon against the sides of the bowl. The mush is chewy, smoky, and vaguely metallic, thanks to the iron skillet you never quite clean properly. But it's warm. And it fills the space where disappointment used to be. You sip something hot. If you're in New England, maybe cider. If you're in Virginia, it might be coffee, made from scorched peas or chicory root. Historians still argue whether early colonial coffee substitutes were acts of ingenuity, or just stubborn defiance in the face of scarcity. Either way, they tasted like regret. You glance at the fire. It's behaving now, a low hiss beneath your breakfast silence. You remember that neighbor, the one who brought over stew in judgment. You suspect they're eating mush, too. Maybe with salt, maybe with a handful of dried berries they've been saving since last July. Maybe they're chewing in silence, too. In colonial America, breakfast was rarely communal. It was utilitarian, half in the dark, often eaten standing. You reach the bottom of your bowl. A crust of molasses clings there, like a reward. You scrape it up with your finger. You don't even care that it's probably seasoned with ash. That's flavor now. You sigh. You've survived another breakfast. Another mushy beginning. And that's something. The spoon clinks in the bowl. The fire crackles. And for one brief, slightly sweet moment, you don't hate your life. The mush has settled. The fire's regained its rhythm. And with your belly somewhat fooled into thinking it's satisfied, you head out to tackle what might be the most underappreciated part of colonial food prep, the foraging walk. Because even with all the preserving, rendering, and ash caking, nothing quite matches the exquisite uncertainty of looking for your next meal in the wild. Mainstream fact? Colonial foraging was vital, especially in early settlements. Indigenous knowledge played a crucial role in teaching European colonists which plants could be eaten, which ones might merely make you vomit for a few hours, and which would end your week entirely. Despite this borrowed wisdom, trial and error still left its mark. You grab a small basket, woven from whatever reeds or vines you found last spring, and begin walking the tree line. The air is sharp. Leaves crunch underfoot. Somewhere, a squirrel hurls a nut with suspicious accuracy. You look for mushrooms cautiously. Some puffballs are edible. Others are not. Colonial guides often offered advice like, "If it makes your lips tingle, wait and see." Reassuring. You spot some wild garlic. A blessing. You dig carefully, roots and all. Add in a handful of purslane, yes, that weed from your garden, and maybe a few ramps if you're lucky. The earth gives slowly, grudgingly. Your hands are cold. Your nose runs. But the basket fills. Quirky tidbit? Colonial settlers sometimes brewed dandelion root, coffee, and used acorns as a flour base once they'd been soaked repeatedly to remove the bitterness. Some even tried milkweed stew, which, if prepared improperly, could cause hallucinations, or visions, as some pious households optimistically called them. You find berries, shriveling but present. High bush cranberries or possibly something less friendly. You sniff. Taste a tiny drop. It's sour. Probably fine. Back at home, you dump your findings onto the wooden table. Your haul roots, herbs, possible berries, and one truly heroic worm who hitched a ride in the garlic bunch. He gets released with honors. Historians still argue whether colonists truly appreciated the diversity of edible plants available to them, or merely saw them as desperation food between harvests. What's clear is that the line between culinary adventure and mild poisoning was razor thin. You rinse everything in a basin of cold rainwater, examining each leaf like a suspicious librarian. Then, with a bit of melted lard and a pinch of salt, you toss the greens into the skillet. They wilt. Fragrance rises. Something in you lifts too. The meal is humble. The fire crackles. Your feet ache. And your tongue still tingles from that experimental berry. But tonight's supper is green. And wild. And weirdly satisfying. You sit by the window, bowl in hand, watching the wind bend the branches outside. You've turned weeds into warmth. Leaves into life. Hunger into something almost poetic. You take another bite. Chew thoughtfully. Tomorrow, you'll forage again. Tonight you rest, and digest, gratefully. After your wild forage supper, 1 part salad, 2 parts survival, you're reminded of another colonial reality. Everything tastes better when you think you might not get it again. Especially sugar. Tonight your mission is sweet, but not simple. You're going to make maple syrup. Mainstream fact? While sugarcane was a luxury in many colonies, maple sugar was a treasured local resource in the Northern Territories, particularly thanks to indigenous techniques. Long before colonists arrived, native peoples had perfected the art of tapping trees, collecting sap, and reducing it into a sticky, amber treasure. Colonists learned, and often botched, the process with sincere enthusiasm. You trudge into the woods with a wooden spile, a small axe, and a hopeful heart. The tree is there, silent and tall, its bark rough but welcoming in a stoic, sugar-producing kind of way. You notch the wood gently, insert the spile, and wait. Drip. Drip. The sap is clear, barely sweet, like the ghost of syrup. But if you boil it, and then boil it some more, well, then you might have something that could pass for pancake topping. If pancakes existed here. Quirky tidbit? Some colonial families believed the best sap came from trees tapped while whispering to them soft, grateful phrases like, "You're a good tree," or, "Give us sweetness or the pig gets it." Okay, maybe not that last one. But the ritual of thanking the tree was common. You gather your bucket slowly. It takes hours to collect even a gallon. And it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. Let that math soothe you. Back in your kitchen, you pour the sap into your largest pot. It hisses, eager to escape. You stoke the fire and begin what will be an all-night affair of reducing, stirring, and fighting the very laws of humidity. Historians still argue whether colonial sugar houses were efficient community ventures or glorified steam rooms of heartbreak. Either way, the process was long, hot, and deeply sticky. Steam rolls off the pot, fogging your windows and frizzing your hair. You stir with a long spoon, eyes watering, skin dewy with syrup-laced sweat. You smell like breakfast and exhaustion. But eventually, hours later, you see it, the darkening color, the thickening swirl, the glossy ribbons forming on the spoon. You've done it. Syrup. You pour it into a clay pot, hands trembling. The smell is divine. Sweet, smoky, slightly woodsy. You dip a spoon in and taste. It's heaven. Burned heaven. Slightly bitter, very sweet, utterly earned. You smile for the first time all day. Tomorrow, you'll ration it like gold, drizzle it on fried mush, drop it into that acorn flour cake, maybe bribe your neighbor with a spoonful. But tonight you cradle the syrup jar like a newborn. Your fingers are sticky. Your fire is low. And your heart is oddly full. Because sometimes, even in a world of ashes, lard, and hard bread, something sweet survives. The maple syrup cools by the hearth, a sticky monument to your stubbornness and steam tolerance. You should go to sleep. You know this. But there's one last thing to do, a quiet ritual to end the day, and perhaps the most delicate task of all. You need to bake. Not a grand cake. Not a buttery pie. Those belong to a future century. No, tonight you're making a humble ash cake. Mainstream fact? Ash cakes were a staple in many parts of colonial America, particularly among those who couldn't afford iron bakeware, or simply didn't have access to it in the wilds. The basic idea was this: mix cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, form it into a patty, then bury it in warm ashes to cook. You heard that right. You bury your food in a fire pit. On purpose. You kneel beside the hearth, brushing aside the glowing embers with a flat stick. You form your cornmeal dough, dry, gritty, barely holding together, and shape it into a thick round. You place it directly on the stone hearth, then sweep hot ashes over it like a sleepy archaeologist hiding treasure. Now you wait. Quirky tidbit? Some colonial folks used cabbage leaves or thin bark as a protective layer under their ash cakes. Others swore that ashes added earthiness, which is a polite way of saying it tasted like breakfast cooked in a volcano. Historians still argue whether ash cakes were born from poverty or convenience. Some believe they were inspired by indigenous earth oven techniques. Others think they were just the inevitable result of someone giving up on their skillet. After about 20 minutes, you gingerly unearth your ash cake. It's charred in places, raw in others. You brush it off, blow gently, and hold it to your nose. It smells like smoke and survival. You break it open. Steam wafts out. The inside is hot and dense, with the texture of damp sand but the taste of food. That's enough. You drizzle a thin ribbon of your precious syrup over the top. The syrup clings, slowly soaking into the crevices. You take a bite. It's warm. It's gritty. It's kind of good. Not good, like bakery good. Good, like, I'm still here, and this didn't kill me. You chew slowly, savoring every sticky grain. You lean back against the wall, legs stretched toward the dying fire. The wind whistles outside. Inside it's quiet. Heavy. Safe. You think of the day, the lard rendering, the vinegar mother, the foraged greens, the syrup marathon. You've cooked with ashes, fought with fire, and eaten every shade of beige known to man. And you've done it all without a refrigerator, a measuring cup, or the faintest idea what calories are. The ash cake, what's left of it, rests on your plate like a relic. You don't need more. And now, as the flames flicker down to coals and your body begins to soften with sleep, it's time to drift. You ease your body back into the familiar creak of your straw-stuffed mattress, the rough linen blankets pulled gently to your chin. The last echoes of the fire pop softly in the hearth, like distant applause for your day's strange, smoky efforts. Your hands still smell faintly of ash and sweet sap. A reminder that, here, in this world of endless scrubbing and stirring, you've made something. Multiple somethings. And none of them tried to kill you today. That's a win. Outside, the wind moves through bare trees with a sighing rustle, soft, steady, like nature's lullaby. It's colder now, but your layers hold firm. The darkness isn't frightening anymore. It's a blanket of its own, wrapping the world in hush. Your body is heavy in that pleasant way that only comes from honest work. Your mind, however, starts to float, drifting through images of ash cakes and vinegar barrels, syrup, steam, and acorn flour. Even the ghost of the mush you ate this morning makes a sleepy cameo. You breathe in slowly. Let it out softer. Everything slows. The air. The thoughts. The rhythm of your heart sinking with the coal's final glow. You've lived a full colonial day. An oddly sweet, deeply weird, totally exhausting day. And you did it in second-hand shoes with questionable soles and a fire that almost betrayed you twice. But here you are. Warm. Fed. Upright-ish. So let the darkness settle in, like cooled molasses in an earthenware jar. Let your muscles unlace like tired corset strings. Let your mind go quiet, soothed by the slow remembering of how people once lived and survived, with patience, ashes, and whatever grew nearby. You're safe now. You can rest. You're home. Hey guys. My name is Stefan. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means a lot and I look forward to bringing you new topics soon. Stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you